Welcome to Extremely Offline. I'm Leighton Woodhouse, and I co-produce XO with Zaid Jilani. On this podcast, we aim to do the opposite of what happens on Twitter. Bring together people from dueling political tribes for substantive, civil debate and discussion. This week, we have two guests from opposite sides of the debate over the state of the Democratic Party and the left. First, we have Jonathan Chait, a longtime left-of-center writer who argues that the Obama years were a stunning success and formed the trajectory the party should pursue in the future. Opposite Chait, we have the Washington Post's Elizabeth Bruenig, who argues that the Obama presidency's shortcomings are part of why democratic socialism is the path forward. On Twitter and Facebook, these two camps, which overlap with the 2016 Hillary versus Bernie divide, snipe at each other incessantly, engaged in a forever war for control of social media narratives. For the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to leave those Twitter tribes behind and go extremely offline.
To start with, I wanted to start with you, Liz. Why is it you think that that people just, why is it that people get so riled up online sometimes talking about you or to you?
I have sort of an unusual perspective, as someone on the left because I'm Catholic. And so, there are lots of different kinds of Catholics in the world, and there are extremely far left Catholics, sort of Latin American tradition of liberation theology, for instance, and then there are plenty of sort of, Catholic worker Catholics in the United States and far left-leaning Catholics. But, even when you come from that left Catholic tradition, there are still things that separate you from, you might call sort of the contemporary secular left. Abortion is one of them, and theism in general is one of them. Even I think the sort of dispositional stuff that you're talking about, sort of how to treat people online, there's an ethic involved in not just Catholicism, but Christianity in general, of sort of respecting human dignity and treating other people the way that you would want to be treated, and more specifically sort of loving your neighbor. And when you take that really seriously, as I try to do and fail to do at times, it manifests in a type of political engagement that's, less rowdy, or less piquant than some people on the left might think is useful. So there are a lot of people on the left who see that kind of engagement as sort of squishy or not as effective or indicative of insufficient commitment to the cause. And I understand all of those criticisms, but they're just sort of like lines that I don't want to cross, just in interacting with other people, even if they're extremely different. And I understand that there's real challenges that are introduced in having those discussions about, how to engage, especially when we're living in a moment of, people have identified sort of incipient fascism, or at least a more pronounced reactionary strand in American politics than we've seen, at least in the past 20 years. So I understand the reasons that people feel really strongly about me. And ultimately, it's not that bad. You can always just turn off Twitter, which I've done a lot more as I've gotten further along in my writing career.
Well, John, I'm curious about this because you've been writing, going back into the 90s. Before there was really social media, there was the internet, but maybe we had message boards or email lists and things like that. How have you seen sort of the introduction of social media, and how has that changed how you feel like people talk about politics, and maybe how you talk about politics?
I use social media in a different way than I think most people do. I don't really pay much attention to the notifications part, the part where people seek me out for responses. What I use it for is I want to build a list of people that I follow to basically feed me mostly articles and links, and maybe as the occasional joke, and use that as a news feed for the most part. And then I also want to use it to broadcast out my own links and, my own jokes that I don't have anything else to do with. But I don't really want to hear what everyone else is saying to me, not because it has no value, but because there's just so many hours in the day. There's books I want to read, articles I want to read that I don't have time for, and I'm not going to use my time sifting through kind of random comments. So without offending, and I'm sure I'm missing a lot of great comments by doing that, but just the signal to noise ratio isn't as good as the things I can read that I'm picking out the people I want to read and have it sent into my feed. I do think social media, and especially Twitter, has given, in particular, the left a greater ability to mimic the dynamic that the right has had for a long, long time. The right really created an echo chamber where conservative movement thought could replicate itself and produce commentary that was just working off of its own agreed on assumptions about the world that didn't really have to engage with the assumptions of people outside of the conservative movement. And the left didn't really have that. They had that in maybe some corners of academia, but not in American politics. The blogosphere created that a little bit, and I think Twitter created that in a much bigger way. And so now you basically have people on the left behaving in a kind of mirror image way that the right had for a really long time.
Well, what's interesting, and I have to remember the year, I think it was either 1994 or 1995, the House Republicans decided to name Rush Limbaugh an honorary member of Congress.
Yeah.
And part of that is because at that point in the 1990s in particular, right-wing talk radio became a massive influencer on the Republican Party and on movement conservatism, and it really wasn't before. And I think there may be a rough analog between that and the way some social media channels are working for the political left right now, in that I think the politicians are often adjusting their messaging based on what they think will, based on getting a feedback or a response from that subgroup. So, for instance, I think people on the right, I think a lot of people on the right probably understand, for instance, that, Islamic terrorism is not the number one threat to America. But you kind of have to say that phrase, radical Islamic terrorism, and if you don't say it, you're terrible, you're a sellout. And I kind of feel like they're doing that just because Fox and talk radio hosts demand that. Maybe parts of their base demand that. Probably even most typical Republicans don't necessarily demand that. And on the left, I think we've seen that with some issues as well. There's certain sloganeering, for instance, abolish ICE. Right? People are saying you should eliminate the enforcement agency for immigration. Now, I've been involved with immigration reform people for years. Close friends with a lot of people in that field. I've never heard anyone say anything like that. But it seemed like something that started on Twitter. Then you saw high-level politicians echoing it without really having a plan or tying it to any kind of broader immigration reform or really showing how it would really help the situation. Liz, do you think that same echo chamber effect is being developed on the left with some of the social feeds?
I mean, I definitely think social media is giving the left an opportunity to sort of talk to each other and, form a kind of message discipline that maybe wasn't present before. I think another issue with the left is that in 2016, this sort of left wing of the Democratic Party kind of emerged as a force in the way that maybe you hadn't seen as unified and vocal before, due to how the primary played out. And, social media was a part of that, but not the whole of that. Social media is more of the expressive side of that development. And I do think you definitely see sort of left movements or trends on social media impacting politicians. And then I think you also see politicians impacting left trends on social media. So AOC's social media presence, for instance, when she tweets something out or she speaks out on a cause, she has a really, they get a big bounce on, what they call left Twitter and left social media. So there's definitely a dialectic there between the politicians who are interested in the left base and the left base on social media.
Do either of you feel like sometimes you have to hold back on what you say on social media because you feel like what you have to say may very well be a mainstream opinion? It may be something that a lot of your friends or neighbors or family would agree with, but you feel like your cohort of people who follow you or who reflect your point of view may just disagree, and you may end up getting invective or that sort of thing for it.
No, because I don't really, I don't have to follow the invective. I don't have to see what people are saying in response to me. Sometimes, though, I can be a little bit of a conflict junkie, and I really enjoy the hate. And my problem is that I get sucked in, to the adrenaline rush of watching people, just pouring the invective on me, and that's a distraction from my work. So I'm trying to discipline myself. Don't get involved in this. I don't get paid to write for Twitter.com. I get paid to write for New York Magazine. I want to use my working time working. so when I'm not working, I can do fun things, right? So it's really a more simple, prosaic calculation for me of just don't get sucked into flame wars that aren't my job. But I don't let that stop me from saying something I think. Like, as part of my writing, I'm not going to hold back on an opinion because people are going to come after me. I mean, I feel like that would be just violating my ethic as a professional, like in a pretty profound way, if I let myself do that.
And Liz, I think for you, something I've noticed is that when you express beliefs about being pro-life, that you tend to get it very, very harshly. And for me, it's unusual because I grew up in the state of Georgia. Probably a majority of my friend base was conservative. I knew pro-life people. I knew pro-choice people. It wasn't really a segregated environment. There's something in social science called the contact hypothesis, that when you have a lot of interaction with people, you tend to fear them less, be less aggravated with them, have less anxiety about what they represent. But I think in the social media sphere, that's definitely like one of the totems you have to put up if you're on the political left, is you have to be pro-choice. So how has that experience been, not kind of being able to put up that totem and kind of standing out from the pack a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm very conflict avoidant. I don't like it. I tend to sort of back out quickly, when it's developing in that way on Twitter. It makes me really nervous. I think that, the actual sort of position I hold on, I think it would be a good idea to, I think if we had better social welfare programs and a better social safety net, if you want to call it that, but essentially, social welfare programs, universal health care, child allowance, universal paid maternity leave, child care assistance, and so forth, I think you would see a drop in rates, right? Just because globally you do see an association between poverty and abortion. And I think that in the reproductive justice community, that's not actually an unusual viewpoint. So there are a lot of pro-choice people who agree with that viewpoint, right? Because they say, well, it's not really a choice if you're pushed into the decision to have an abortion by poverty, not sort of by your own will or your life circumstances, but just by the fact that you don't have these material resources that you need. And so you have to make that determination. So I think that the viewpoint is not actually that bizarre. And it's even common in, some left or left-leaning quarters. I just think that, the left feels like they have to maintain a really strong discipline on the pro-choice issue. And I think that you've seen the emergence of a very strong rhetoric of, abortion at any point in pregnancy on demand for free, or, funded by the state. I think that's emerging as a sort of goalpost for some people on the left. And so expressing any type of hesitance about it, even a sort of moral hesitance, even the sort of like safe, legal, and rare language that was, pretty typical in the 90s, is seen at this point as being reactionary and regressive and really dangerous to the movement.
I would actually add on to your point, which is that I'm sort of traditional pro-choice. I don't write about it very much, don't have a lot of expertise, but I have conventional liberal views on this. But I do find that a lot of people on the whole left side of the spectrum tend to not give anti-abortion people credit for actually believing what they say they believe, right? The belief that the fetus is a human and has rights and you're actually killing someone, not a belief I share whatsoever. But I do credit people on that side with believing that. And I find a broad hesitation to give them credit for saying that. And I see a lot of people saying they only want to control women's bodies, and that's the only motivation that people might have. And I just find that very hard to believe, and that seems to be a bad way to engage with people's arguments.
Well, that is, I think that's one of the heuristics that drives polarization. So heuristic is basically a mental shortcut. And I think one of the mental shortcuts people make is to question other people's motives rather than to give them credit for actually being well-intentioned, good-natured, moral people. They just derive different conclusions than you do. And Liz, I think what John was saying was really interesting, in that I think that's what a lot of people maybe online end up saying to you, that it isn't so much that you have some concern about human life, it's that you basically are in a position that they can easily villainize, meaning you want to control people's bodies, you're paranoid about sexual activity, this comes entirely from your religious dogma, et cetera, et cetera. Why is it you think that people jump to those conclusions, and how is it that you keep yourself from doing the same to them when they're coming at you?
Well, so I really do believe that most people, if not, so there's sort of like two positions you can hold on the pro-choice side, and I make an effort to read very deeply of the sort of serious writing on this, and sort of people. You have a group of people who say, like, yeah, the fetus may or may not actually be a human person, but there are situations in which it's acceptable to kill a human person, and that one of them is, they're violating your bodily integrity or autonomy, and in that case, it's acceptable. Then there's another set who says, like, well, no, it's not a person yet. It doesn't have the characteristics of personhood. It doesn't have a consciousness that we know of, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I try not to presume malice, right? I mean, I doubt that's the situation. I also know that there are a lot of people who have personal experiences that are very difficult, that are sort of mediating the way that they respond to me. And then another thing that just happens on the internet is when you encounter someone and they have a view you don't like, they're suddenly not like a specific individual with a specific view that has, like nuance. They're suddenly an avatar for everyone you've never liked who has that view. And so you end up imputing onto them all these characteristics that they don't actually have.
Well, I think I'd be amiss if I didn't discuss probably the latest, most high-profile example of that, which is that we had this situation with these teenagers on the National Mall who came from Covington Catholic High School out in, I think, Kentucky area. And I think a lot of the rush to judgment of those teenagers was that they had become an avatar of what people feared. I believe James Fallows is a brilliant writer, excellent reporter. No disrespect to him, but at The Atlantic, he immediately wrote an article comparing them to students who had resisted racial integration in the 1950s, who threw things at African Americans, who jeered at them, cursed at them. But this was from a 30-second video clip. To me, it seemed like he had instantly made that mental shortcut of, okay, I understand exactly where these people are coming from. I understand everything about their lives. I understand their political ideology from a 30-second video clip. John, when you watched that happen, did you feel like there was kind of political tribalism at work there, that just basically everyone was making this up based on their sort of the larger archetypes that they see in American politics, rather than actually looking at the individuals at play?
I had the same reaction Fallows did, I have to say. I wrote a tweet sort of saying that, I hope their parents are ashamed of them. I just had a visceral response to the clip. And then I realized, I heard some people saying it might be more complicated. I didn't know what the answer was, so I deleted my tweet and just decided I don't actually have to know what happened. I don't want to delve into the competing analyses. So I just decided, I still don't actually know what happened. I decided whatever, something happened, I don't have to have an opinion. But I actually totally fell prey to the dynamic you displayed. Like, those kids looked to me like really terrible people, and I made a rush judgment.
Liz, do you feel like the fact that they were Catholic, and I know that's a religious tradition you come from, also played into sort of the mental shortcuts that people were making to sort of paint a picture of them without knowing everything about them?
Well, and they had been at the March for Life, right? So there was sort of already a precondition there to develop, a negative opinion of them. And then the way that they were dressed, the MAGA hats and all of that, just sort of, even if there was no sound and you knew nothing about the situation, all of the preconditions were there to develop a really negative opinion based on sort of signals that people, already have preformed opinions to. One of them is the March for Life and is anti-abortion politics. And the March for Life, of course, for the last couple of years has involved the Trump administration, right? So a lot of March for Life people try to set it up as being like an ecumenical and bipolar political thing. Anybody, if any, secular people are here and left people are here, but in reality, it is very right-leaning, and it has this relationship for the past couple of years with the Trump administration. So I think that people had this a kind of immediate reaction to all of the signals that were there.
It's interesting. John used a phrase earlier when we were talking about the abortion debate, which was safe, legal, and rare. Now that was a common.
That was Liz, yeah. That was.
Oh, Liz, I'm sorry.
In the 90s, yeah.
So that was a common mantra in the 1990s that the Democratic Party used. And John, actually, I'm interested in this because you were writing about politics before myself and before Liz in the 90s. The Democratic, from my for perception, the Democratic Party rhetorically on social issues has moved very much to the left during those years. How have you seen that transformation? What do you think is causing it? And do you think that it's putting the political party in a more politically tenuous position or a strengthened position?
Certainly, I've seen my position vis-a-vis the Democratic Party change. I feel like I was criticizing the Clinton administration and Democratic leaders from the left a lot when I started out. Now they've moved to the left to the point where I feel like, whereas when I started I was on the left wing of the Democratic Party, not the far left wing, but definitely left of center. Now I'm more in the middle of the Democratic Party. So sometimes I criticize them from the left, like on the filibuster. Sometimes I criticize them from the right. I think there's a tendency to move as far as you can and while you feel politically safe. So the Democratic Party is going to get pushed further left as public opinion allows it. Maybe sometimes activists will get ahead of themselves and push the party a little bit too far to the left from the standpoint of the safe position for winning elections. But there's a trade-off, right, of pushing debate more to your side versus taking risks of losing elections. But I think there's really no question, since I've been following politics since the early 90s, public opinion is moving to the left and Democrats are getting more confident.
Well, it's interesting. So you wrote an article recently basically looking at where the position of the Democratic Party will be going into the next presidential election, sort of what orientation the candidates will take and who is likely to be the next president. And I think you also wrote a book about with similar themes about President Obama and some of sort of the achievements under his presidency. And I think you've made the point a number of times that he sort of remains the most popular figure in the Democratic Party, or one of the most popular, certainly in public opinion polling. He's also popular outside the party among independents. Most people would say that he probably would have defeated President Trump had he run for a third term. And you've listed off a number of sort of achievements from him, ranging from the Affordable Care Act to the stimulus to the Dodd-Frank legislation. Yet President Obama seems to be coming under a lot of fire from left-wing activists. A number of candidates seem to be taking positions, such as Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, that are in some ways a repudiation of the Obama approach. How do you view that criticism, and why is it you think that President Obama still is kind of in the sweet spot for Democrats in terms of where their orientation will be?
Wow, that's a very deep question. I think you're identifying a disconnect between progressive movement activists in the Democratic Party. And by the Democratic Party, I mean both the professional political establishment and the voting base. The progressive activists are well to the left of both those things. I would say, like, I'm right my views would put me sort of right in the middle of the Democratic Party, both the voters and the politicians. But on sort of in social media circles, I'm way, way, way to the right. I'm like a right-wing nut within progressive Twitter. So there's a huge disconnect there. During the Obama administration, you had lots and lots of complaints from the left all along, starting literally before Obama did a single thing. Even before the inauguration, there was criticism that Obama had sold out through his inauguration. Remember, he brought in Rick Warren to be one of the speakers at his inauguration, and
Right.
Obama has already sold out.
I feel like it would be impossible to see even the most right-wing candidate in the Democratic primary today say, I'm going to bring on a somewhat anti-gay rights, somewhat pro-life pastor to talk at one of my big events.
I mean, on the other hand, a pretty classic Obama move of saying this doesn't have any substantive ramifications, right? I'm going to throw this bone to the side of show this message of I'm hearing you, I'm hearing your values. I'm not necessarily going to enact laws that Rick Warren likes, but I'm going to respect him and listen to what he has to say. So I guess that's my answer, is that you're just talking about a disconnect between where the party is and where the activists are.
Liz, I feel like there's a generational shift here. So I think, John, you grew up under the Clinton administration writing professionally about politics. I'm sure to John, much of what President Obama did was absolutely unimaginable under President Bill Clinton, under the composition of, the leadership of Tom Daschle, for instance. So I think from John's perspective, he can kind of see a lot of what Obama said is just like, I remember actually I was working at Center for American Progress, which was kind of Obama's think tank when they passed the Affordable Care Act. And to everyone, it was like they had just seen Jesus come back to life or something, right? It's like, Clinton failed at this, so many presidents failed at doing this, Obama finally got it done, he really is the best president of our lives. I think in the years since, particularly with the Bernie Sanders campaign, with Elizabeth Warren getting on the scene, we've seen a lot of harsher criticism towards the Obama approach from the left. And I think particularly the generation that you come from, Liz, of progressive activists, generally don't identify very much with President Obama and don't really look to his policy path as where they want the future to be. You know, how do you kind of relate yourself, but also the cohort you think that you're part of, and how it relates to President Obama?
So I come from sort of a weird cohort on the left. You know, even when Obama was running in 2008, when I was in high school, I was dating a guy who writes on the left now, Matt Bruenig, who even at the time didn't like Obama and felt like the policies that were being promised were sort of unacceptable compromises with free market capitalism, that they weren't a big ideological departure from sort of liberal capitalism, and that they would represent a kind of entrenchment of a capitalist way of managing social problems that ultimately need a non-capitalist solution if they're ever going to be really solved. And I don't think that Obama would disagree, right? He didn't see himself as a radical leftist. It was always this kind of great joke.
It's very fair. That's a very fair encapsulation.
Yeah, and I think it was always this sort of great joke of the Obama administration that the right wing depicted him as a communist, right? I think it was, which was not what his intention was, not how he marketed or sold his policies, and not their effect. So the sort of very far left at the time was already sort of displeased with what the plan was. I think Obama's execution was good, right? I mean, of what he promised. You know, especially given the failures that Clinton had to trying to do the same thing. You know, new criticisms from the left emerged during the administration, bringing on Geithner and the foreclosure crisis, and sort of choosing to kind of foam the runway for the banks instead of, you know, redirecting funds to rescuing people in foreclosure and so forth, and then not nationalizing the banks or breaking them up or any of these other solutions that I think the far left, you know, and the Occupy movement was live at the time, kind of envisioned. But again, that was never Obama's pitch. That was never what he promised. It wasn't like he promptly marketed himself as a socialist and then came in and was a fairly moderate president. The madness of the administration and of those years politically was that he promised to do what he did. He did it. Mm-hmm. And then the right wing absolutely melted down over it, right? And behaved as though they had like a socialist infiltrator in the White House.
So I guess what you're saying is both you and Matt wanted a real socialist infiltrator
right.
in the White House.
There was never a sense of betrayal from Obama, which I think some people who have come to the left since the Sanders campaign felt like they were betrayed by the Obama administration because they really believed going into it essentially what the right wing said.
Well, so one of the reasons I wrote my book and made the argument is that I feel like a lot of people on the left were making not the smart argument that you make, but saying that Obama betrayed his values. And I wanted to make the case that he actually fulfilled his promises to a really high degree. He really got done the things he said he was going to get done. And people were making that complaint, not the one that Liz is making.
Well, I think I can synthesize what both of you are saying in that, you know, I guess I was more in the Liz and Matt camp in 2008. You know, I didn't vote for Obama. I voted for Nader and Gonzalez.
Of course, yeah.
And now Gonzalez is most known for getting off an undocumented immigrant who was firing a gun drunkenly in San Francisco and ended up killing a woman. So I don't even know if I necessarily stand by that vote.
Oh, you can't walk away from Ralph.
Yeah, Ralph, sure, but Gonzalez on the ticket. I mean, of course, everyone deserves legal representation. I'm just saying it's not necessarily a great thing to be known for.
Sure.
But you know what's really interesting is that, yeah, when I think about Obama and how I analyzed him in 2008, he did mostly say who he was. I mean, he never said he was on the furthest left, and you know, you had candidates like Dennis Kucinich, you had John Edwards kind of positioning himself that way as more a left-wing candidate. And I think really the only major promise I can think of him breaking was probably around NAFTA. I think he pretended to be a little bit more critical of the free trade arrangements than he ended up being.
Well, that's very difficult politically, as we're seeing right now. I mean, even someone like Trump, as bombastic as Trump, who came in really hard on NAFTA, is really struggling to do anything with it.
But I think for the most part, both of you actually somewhat agree in that he didn't represent himself as far to the left. He didn't govern as far to the left. And I think that a number of people who say that he's betrayed them, he's a sellout, maybe they didn't pay super close attention to sort of, how he was campaigning, the political tradition he came from. But I think where we all may disagree a little bit more is kind of going forward. I think John has kind of eloquently, intelligently made the argument that Obama remains the most popular figure out there. If he ran again, I'm sure he would defeat President Trump in the 2020 election. But we're seeing a lot of criticism of sort of his approach from the left. So maybe I'll take one issue. I think that President Obama and his team, and knowing just the folks at CAP who helped put together health reform, I think to them, they basically see the health insurance system as it currently stands as being kind of a uniquely American feature. You can't put millions of people who work in that industry out of work. Americans like choice. A lot of Americans like their health insurance plans. So I think President Obama wanted to expand health insurance in a way that didn't disrupt that kind of status quo, but also get a lot more people covered. And they did get, tens of millions of more people covered. I think that a lot of the Sanders-esque movement that's out there now is saying, hey, actually the system is fundamentally broken. We want to move towards something like what Canada has, where we basically have the government insuring everybody. The healthcare is free at the point of service. I think, John, recently you wrote something relating to Kamala Harris being asked whether she would try to eliminate the private health insurance industry. She said yes. The next day she walked it back a little bit, saying she's open to other kind of compromises. Can you talk a little bit about why you think that was kind of a problematic promise for her to agree to?
So I think your summary was fair, although you have to add Obama always said if we were starting from scratch, we would design single payer.
Right. Just like the Republicans say if we were starting from scratch, we'd have a national sales tax or something. Which is, it is a meaningful point, I think, but it's like everyone deals with political realities.
So he wasn't saying there's something about the American character that requires private health insurance, requires choices. I don't think he says there's anything about that. It's just that through a historical accident, we have this misshapen system that's grown up and has grown so entrenched like a misshapen tree that that uprooting it and changing it would cause massive transitional dislocations that are very hard just politically to work your way through. That basically, you've got all these problems with the system, but the big part is all these people who can't afford the care. Take care of those people who can't afford the care and leave the people who have insurance and like it, even if you know that if you could pass single payer, if you could move them all onto Medicare, in the long run they'd be happier and they realize they're better off, but you can't actually convince them in advance that they'll be better off. They're never going to believe you, and they're never going to want to pay all the taxes that they have to pay, even though, yes, it comes out of their premiums would just go down and it would even out. Winning that fight is too hard. Focus on the fight you can win.
Yeah, so Liz, how is the left seeing this now? It seems like the Democratic Socialists for America have a Medicare for All campaign. It seems like Sanders is going to announce for presidency be very hard on this single-payer plan. It seems like the concerns that John has raised, that basically the system is very well entrenched politically and substantively, and it's very difficult to move it to a full public system as single-payer. How does the left respond to that?
I mean, I think that the sort of serious, writers and policy thinkers on the left recognize it take a lot of political will and a lot of political capital to make it happen, which is why Medicare for All has to be the top priority of a presidential candidate who's going to push it. It can't be like it is for, I think, several of the Democrats who've already declared something that they list as a possible eventual goal, but obviously it's several rungs down the priority list. I think that signals either a naivete about how incredibly heavy of a lift it's going to be, or it signals that for the candidates who listed as kind of like a third or fourth or fifth priority, they're nodding to the Sanders base, but they're actually not really politically committed to something as big as Medicare for All. For the candidates who put that, on their, who take it seriously, who take Medicare for All seriously, they recognize it's going to have to be priority number one, and it's going to take everything they've got. I think that in terms of addressing the challenges John brings up, they're serious. Folks on the left, my husband writes about phase-ins, start with children, or start with people, who are maybe close to eligible for Medicaid, and just expand, like the expansions in Medicaid that took place under Obamacare. right? Just start doing expansions, bring on children. You can do this over a sequence of years. Pick up all the people who are still uninsured under the ACA. And over time, as these children who are inducted upon birth grow up, and you pull people into Medicare as they get older, you're eventually going to be able to achieve a pretty good phase in.
So I think one of the retorts we're hearing, and John wrote an article about Beto, and Beto O'Rourke may end up being a 2020 candidate. He's kind of off writing diaries all over America right now, trying to figure that out. But Beto, basically, he started out by saying he was for single payer. Over a year, that evolved into him saying, I like single payer, but I'm open to all kinds of different ways to ensure people. Maybe we can have a public-private type system, sort of like what President Obama was sort of envisioning. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with saying, why can't we just have universal coverage without the government being the one to do the universal coverage?
So I think for people on the left, there are a few issues with that. For one, it creates a situation where the people who are, opting into the public option are people who can't opt into or who can't afford private health insurance. And so a lot of the times the costs wind up being higher per person for people who are opting into the public option, which can kind of put an unfair strain just because of selection on that system. As to where private insurance, you get a much more random sampling of people to support the system. The other issue is political resilience, right? The ACA was pretty quickly damaged when Republicans came into control. And part of the reason was it didn't touch everybody, right? The Medicaid, the expansions that took place actually stuck around. Those were effective. But the exchanges and those other pieces and parts of this very complicated law were easier to damage politically because lots of people felt like they were annoying and useless and didn't have a stake in them, and getting rid of them didn't affect them at all. But when you have universal coverage, when you go to abandon that program, you're going to be affecting, your own family, your own constituents, absolutely, people in your communities. And so it becomes much more politically resilient. And you can sort of see this with the NHS. In the UK, there are certainly right-leaning parties that attempt to attack the NHS, but full revocation and destruction of the NHS is not a very politically popular proposition.
So, John, I think that what if you said Cory Booker or Kamala Harris or one of the candidates that's not considered as left-leaning came out and said, actually, I think it would be a great idea to have the Dutch system of healthcare or the Japanese system, where you have a network of sort of tightly regulated, often regulated to be not-for-profit health insurers covering Americans instead. Would you see that as comparable to what single payer would achieve and pretty much an acceptable point of view to have?
I think it's definitely an acceptable point of view to have. I mean, they're all acceptable points of view to have. I don't think it makes sense for Democrats to run in this election saying you're going to move to single payer and putting yourself in a position where Trump can run ads against you, saying he's going to get rid of your employer health insurance and throw you on some government plan, because I think that creates a vulnerability in an election for no benefit. And the reason it's no benefit is it doesn't matter how committed the president is, you're not going to pass that in 2021. Because you're not going to have 60 senators or even 50 senators who can pass that plan. So, focus your platform, your priorities on things that are achievable.
So, Liz, what do you say? Are the Sanders folks being a little naive here and kind of overshooting the possibilities?
Well, I think part of the issue is that in order to build political will around an issue, you have to focus campaigns on it, right? Campaigns are not only for winning, but they're also for focusing and directing political energy, right? So prior to Sanders, there was definitely a left movement in the United States, but where did this energy for Medicare for All come from? I mean, why is it something we're seriously discussing? It's because Sanders ran a campaign around it. And that focused political energy.
Well, it's interesting. I know, I believe his name is Max Fine. He was one of John Kennedy's Medicare architects. He was tapped by Lyndon Johnson to be the top oppo person on the health insurance industry, and he's still around. And I actually asked him about, where he thinks healthcare should go next, and he was definitely on board with single payer, and he really doesn't like any of these mixed plans that have been put out to have public options or whatnot. And I think, part of that, again, we get to a generational shift, because I think in the 60s, the Democrats at that point basically decided that they wanted to create a Medicare program. They wanted to make it mandatory. You couldn't opt out of it. They didn't want it to be a public matter of options or choice. But I think in the years since, the Democratic Party has, I think, embraced a little bit more of that market logic of saying that actually Americans really value their options, their choices. They don't want to be thrown into something that they can't require. And it's kind of interesting because when Paul Ryan says that about Medicare or Social Security, Democrats still get their hackles up and say, no, we don't want to make that a choice. Like, that would weaken the system, et cetera, et cetera. But also, to John's point, those systems are already in place. We don't have to shock Americans with putting those in place in the first place. So again, it's just kind of a generational shift, which is pretty interesting. And I think, Liz, what you're sort of arguing back would kind of bring it back towards the Great Society New Deal approach, which was more or less was putting people into government program whether or not they wanted it because they felt like it would be better in the long run.
Right. And I mean, in terms of choice, there's sort of rhetorical approaches you can take to Medicare for All that make it sound more one way or more the other. But I think one of the great things, or the approach I take, is calling it single payer, right? Because that makes it clear. It's not a single payer, single provider, right? We're not the NHS, although I don't think there's anything wrong with the NHS. It emphasizes the fact that, you still have your multiplicity of doctors out there and your range of specialists. And it's not as though your current doctor who you like is going to be disappeared into the ether and then you're never going to see them again. It's just that they're getting paid by someone other than Aetna.
Can I
Sure.
push back a little bit on this? It's not exactly what you're saying, but I feel like a lot of the criticism that I tried to record in my book about Obamacare from the left was this idea that he capitulated to private interests in the design of the plan in a way that classic Democrats never did. I mean, obviously FDR tried and failed. Right. Truman tried and failed. Johnson wanted to do universal insurance. But first the insurers said, no, we like covering people who are under 65. They're profitable. We don't want to cover the old people. They're not profitable. So you just cover them. And Johnson says, okay, that's what I'll cover. I'll cover the people you don't want who are not profitable for you. Then the doctors and the hospitals basically say, we're not happy about the government coming in, but we really don't want you having any control over the payments. So basically the payment's going to be whatever we charge, the government writes a check. And Johnson said, okay, I want to pass this bill, I'll do that. So the providers control the payment system, the insurers control who gets covered completely, and Medicare is the result of that. Now, it's a great program, but it's totally limited in those two huge ways. It doesn't cover anyone under 65, and the costs explode. Doctors reap a fortune.
I definitely think, and I think Max wouldn't disagree with this if you asked him, I think they did intend to cover everybody, and the 65 was definitely a compromise. I think they had often floated doing kiddie care next and having kids covered next, which is something that Medicare didn't do, although they kind of did with CHIP with private insurers. But I think the point I was making more was not that they compromised more or less back then, but that they didn't necessarily have a vision of marketplaces and choice. That wasn't necessarily... I think President Obama thought that his health insurance marketplace was like a good idea. Like, he thinks that health insurance exchanges can bring prices down. Whereas I think the Johnson administration would not have gone for an idea like that just because it wasn't necessarily their ideological tilt.
Yes, but see, here's the thing. So they had to cover a cohort of people that aren't easily defined, right? So the people who got sliced off by the insurers under Medicare were people over 65.
Right.
So we've got everyone, the entire population, easy to define. You've got to be 65, that's it.
Right.
How do you define who gets covered under a new plan that only is going to cover people who don't have workplace insurance? If you just open it up in the same way that Medicare was, then how do you just keep employers from dumping everyone into that pool? Then you create the problem of like, all right, then the Republicans can say you're going to get thrown off your employer health insurance plan, right? So in order to create, you've got a much more difficult technocratic challenge in covering that population that's kind of mixed right in with the working age insured population. So that's where I think they got to. Secondly, they had 60 Senate votes, exactly 60 on the dot for about 3 months. You had a period after you had the appointment of a replacement senator in Massachusetts and the appointment of Al Franken, and before the special election in Massachusetts. Very, very narrow range. Most of this time you're negotiating with Republicans, so you're trying to get a plan that can appeal to Republicans and in so doing get moderate Democrats who don't want to vote for a Democrat-only plan.
Well, Liz, going forward, though, how do you address some of those concerns that John raised in terms of the public again? Like, are people that attached to their health insurance plans that if they were campaigning on replacing those plans with a public plan, which is sort of what Johnson and Kennedy were more open to, but as John mentioned, they also compromised in other areas. How do you manage that political problem in a way that you think would make the Sanders strategy viable?
A lot of it is about information, right? So I think right now when you poll people and you ask, do you like your health insurance? What they hear is, well, my provider network? You mean all the doctors I see? Now I have Kaiser Permanente, so my health insurance is also my provider. It's a little tiny single payer, single provider system, little NHS unto itself. And so when you say to someone who's in, a condition like I am, well, we're taking away your health insurance, that registers as, okay, so you're taking away my OB who delivered my baby and is going to deliver this one. And that is jarring. So I think for Sanders, part of the challenge is making a distinction between the providers and the insurers and clarifying what the insurers actually do. Right, so we have this notoriously complicated and very opaque system of insurance where what your insurers do for you, how they make the decisions they make about your provider networks, the way funds are allocated and how they decide whether or not to cover all of the problems that you have are mysterious, right? And so I think that for Sanders sort of clarifying that a lot of these processes that go on in the insurance industry are duplicative, are arbitrary, are profit-driven, will help make the distinction that needs to be made between sort of the doctors who give you your care and with whom you have a personal relationship based on your health and well-being, and the insurers who, just by happenstance, have come to sort of dominate the way that we go to the doctor in the United States. So there's a problem of political will, and then there's a problem of information, and seeing as this whole thing really got kicked up in a big way 2 years ago, I think we've all come a long way pretty quickly. So I don't think it's an undoable thing. I do think it's going to take some will and some time.
Can I just make one quick point about that? Which is the enthusiasm you saw for the defense of Obamacare from repeal was so intense. I think in comparison to the relative blasé attitude outside of the Center for American Progress and my house and Jonathan Cohn and a handful of other people for the passage of Obamacare, like when that law passed, like I was like the cat people, like I ran outside, like I was expecting to see joyous VE Day crowds and no one cared. But like repeal really was like that, right? So like this is something of progressive psychology of, we just don't want to celebrate progress, but we get really angry at the idea of
So I want to shift gears a little bit going on that point, which is, I think this is one of the things that I see online. So for instance, like Steven Pinker, smart guy, but kind of a celebrity psychologist. So, he's hit or miss sometimes, but he's written a book called Enlightenment Now, where he talks about various means and measures of human progress over since the Enlightenment and over particularly the 20th century. He gets into it quite a bit. I think the book's fairly banal. I think what he's saying is fairly banal. I'm from my family's from Pakistan. If you talk to Indians and Pakistanis and Chinese and people who are living in the vast share of global extreme poverty for the past 20 or 30 years, they think the world has vastly improved over the past since the 80s and 90s. But the kind of vitriol I think he gets just for recognizing the progress really has taken me aback. I mean, a former colleague of mine, Mehdi Hassan, had him on his show. I was just like yelling at him, and it's just like, I think that there is something within activist psychology, and maybe it's not even just on the left, it may be on the right as well, to where they have a hard time recognizing progress that has been made because they feel like if you do that therefore you don't want any further progress.
Right, you're letting down your guard. You're losing all the energy you need for demanding more improvement.
We hope you're enjoying Extremely Offline. Right now, we're paying for the show mostly out of our own pocket. We'd like that to change. If you have a few dollars a month to spare, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/extremely-offline and chip in just $3 a month to keep this podcast going. Thank you so much.
In psychology, I mean, they call a lot of this catastrophic thinking, which is that you automatically jump to the most negative space and you can't give yourself the breathing room to have awareness of where you are and what you've achieved and so on and so forth. And I'm wondering, like Liz, do you feel like you ever see this online when you're interacting with activists or when you're talking about the state of things?
Yeah, well, I think that you see like two very different ways of thinking about the world on the left. And one takes sort of, the kind of liberal democratic world we live in to hold a promise, right? So the liberal democratic vision holds a promise for how things should be, and it should be full equality, and it should be full freedom, and it should be extremely positive, and all of these developments should happen, under a liberal democratic regime. And so if you have someone like Pinko say like, well, actually things have gotten pretty good, but you're someone who believes in the liberal democratic vision and wants to improve it, your response to that is going to be like, no, if liberal democratic philosophy was working, we wouldn't have poverty, we wouldn't have inequality at the levels that we do, we wouldn't have all of these problems that I take very seriously. So it simply must be the case that it's not working and it's being contained or held back or corrupted from within in some kind of way that we can erase, remove, fix, and then we will have the unfolding of the true promise of sort of liberal democracy. On the other hand, I think there's a way of looking at history that's like liberal democratic capitalism is a phase, right? Things get better in that phase, or they change in multiple directions. A reduction in global poverty is one of those directions. Nobody said liberal capitalism's bad at producing commodities. It's very good at producing commodities. And then distribution is another phase in history. So moving forward, things can get better. It was never the case that sort of the way that we were living under sort of liberal democratic capitalism was the eschaton. That was never going to be the thing that solved everything. It was going to get us to another point in terms of production where we can move forward. And so I think that way of looking at history can tolerate, right, or at least incorporate and synthesize the view that things have gotten vastly better, but still maintain that's not the end. I think the other view, which kind of views, sort of liberal democratic capitalism, the way we've been doing politics in the United States for the past couple hundred years, as the sort of end-all be-all, as a self-perfecting mechanism, they have a harder time admitting that things have gotten better and yet maintaining that they still need to change.
Well, I think that was a very, very thorough assessment of sort of the two camps. What camp, I mean, I could probably guess, but what camp do you feel like you fall in?
I think history has phases and that, things have improved globally. They've changed in lots of ways. I don't think anybody wants to revert to feudalism.
Do you feel annoyed when you, and not personal to John, but do you feel annoyed when you see some writing similar to John's that talks about the achievements of the Affordable Care Act, of the Dodd-Frank bill, of the stimulus package? Do you feel like that's undermining sort of your point of view about what needs to happen in the future?
No, I'm like, thank you for that. Good work on those achievements. It's not the end, and the mechanism by which they unfolded is not the end, right? There has to be another chapter here. So it's like saying, the creation of factories and the production of commodities and the rise of cities, in some sense, enabled a left politics to emerge. It's like, that's good, that's great. It doesn't mean that, working in factories under poor conditions or living in badly maintained urban centers as we were in the late 1800s is the end-all be-all, or the mechanism by which we're going to achieve, the type of society we want to see.
John, do you feel like you get the same backlash that sort of the Pinko gets when you talk about those achievements from folks on the left? Like, do you feel like they're basically telling you that you have to be more fatalistic in order to advocate for progressive change?
Yeah, I would say that's at the top of the list of things people hate me for on the left, but it's definitely on the list. I guess I would somewhat flip around what Liz is saying, or at least look at it from a different angle, which is that I feel like the left, like I wrote about in my book, spend most of the Obama administration just bitching about him having sold everything out and failing at everything. But the left, as we were sort of all agreeing at the beginning, had much less voice, much less power. So if it behaves the same way in the next Democratic administration, even if the next Democratic administration is as successful as Obama is, moves the ball as far left as Obama did, which I think I'd be thrilled if that was the case, because that's hard to do. They're just going to tear that president apart, even if it's Bernie Sanders. Like, the expectations are so out of line with what historically happens in the United States that it's just going to feel like a failure to everyone. But that feeling like a failure will be so much worse that it could be like a 1968 situation. It could just, the administration won't have a chance to succeed.
Well, what's interesting is I think, we can also apply this to the Trump administration. I mean, I think an area where I feel kind of out of step with folks sometimes is when, I'm obviously not super sympathetic to the Trump administration or to right-wing Republicans, but I often feel like the way that they're describing the country now under President Trump, it seems like there are people on the left who describe it as if it's much worse than the Great Recession, as if it's worse than the Iraq War, George Bush presidency. And honestly, when I look around, I see that the economy is doing okay. I don't support many of the policy priorities of the Republicans. I didn't support the tax cut bill. I don't like Supreme Court nominees, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't necessarily see the country in crisis. And I feel like this is something that left and also the wider liberal space has been promoting a lot over the past couple of years. I mean, they called their anti-Trump movement the resistance, so on and so forth. Do you, John, especially you've been following this for decades now under Republican and Democratic presidents. Do you remember it being like this under Bush with liberals, or do you feel like there was a distinct difference from how they're viewing the country now?
Well, I mean, people were very upset, myself included, under George W. Bush, but much more so now. There's a really interesting debate going on. I mean, Trump has clear, undeniable authoritarian instincts and desires. He has not been able to act on most of them yet. He's got 2 more years to go in this term, possibly 6 more years to go in his presidency. And he's also very, very weak, which has thwarted his authoritarianism, but I think has also created a lot of serious tail risks that we don't see by just disabling the effectiveness of the federal government. And so much of what the federal government does is protect us from low probability disasters, that every single one of those low probability disasters is more likely than it used to be. You can almost think of it like an airplane with, some kind of animal that's just going through and just tearing out random wires and throwing them, into the air. Like for a while, the plane's going to keep flying and it's going to seem fine. And then at some point, something will happen and it just won't be able to fly anymore. Maybe we're going to make it all the way through and land, but that's the way I think about it.
Well, it's interesting because I guess what I'm trying to get at is the crisis mentality that I think we see with some of your left critics, maybe some of critics of President Trump, who, for instance, were very vocal about deportations under Trump, but don't realize that actually he's deported less people than Obama did. I think, this mentality is shifting, especially the political left, into a space which I don't remember necessarily in my life under Bush, which is that I think there was some writer over in the UK who said this. He said something like, maybe it was Douglas Murray, but he said something like, I'm a critic of my country, I'm not an opponent of my country. And I think there has been a shift in the tone of the political left to where America, capitalism, the racial order of the country, the gender order of the country is viewed as similar to like original sin. Whereas in the past, I think under Bush or under previous presidents, I think the political left was orienting itself in a way that said that we're critics of this country, but we believe that basically it's one of the best places in the world. We basically think that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were great documents, and we believe in sort of King's adage that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Whereas now I feel like I see, but a lot of what I see on the left side of the rhetoric, which is that America is a white supremacist state. It's an imperialist country. It's the most imperialist country in the world. We don't have human rights here. We don't have civil rights here. I guess the mentality that I'm seeing, not only is it necessarily denying the progress made under the Obama administration, it seems like it's denying progress, period. It seems like if you disagree with that, therefore that means you're not for making any improvements.
I feel like you're making something close to my point of view, so maybe it's more fair to let Liz respond.
Right. Yeah, Liz, why don't you jump in here? Do you feel like you see that mentality? Am I correctly summarizing it? And second, do you feel like there is something more to that than what I'm giving it credit for?
Well, so I think what you're seeing is a rise or not a rise, let's put it this way. You're seeing a loss of confidence in liberalism. So when people say the foundational documents were not actually capable by design of achieving the promises they made, that, the founding documents of the country have all these promises about freedom and equality, but then they also have a built-in capacity for slavery, for instance. Or America is imperialist, and so maybe not the most imperialist country in human history, but that's something that also seems contrary to kind of the promise of a nation that is supposed to respect self-determination and freedom. So I think for a lot of people, it's a shock to encounter those contradictions for the first time. And, one of the responses is, therefore, this place is just garbage. I think that if you have a long history sort of being critical of liberalism, you'll be like, yeah, America's a fairly typical liberal country. All of the liberal nations of the Enlightenment participated in colonialism. They were highly imperial. They also had founding documents that, on the one hand, kind of enshrined this, like you said, Whig view of history. Things are getting better and better, and it's bending towards justice. At the same time, had the capacity to tolerate slavery or other forms of really unacceptable oppression, and that's just sort of baked into the cake. It's something you get with liberal nations. I think that that doesn't mean that liberalism is worse than a lot of forms of anti-liberalism. One of the weird facts of liberalism in history is that liberalism has, when you live under it, you begin to think all forms of anti-liberalism are the same. And you become entranced by the idea that everything that came before liberalism and everything that'll come, in a post-liberal world is identical in some kind of way, and that's not the case, right? There are forms of anti-liberalism that are much worse than liberalism, and there are forms of sort of radicalized liberalism that improve it, right? So you can conceive of something, democratic socialism as a radicalized or purified form of liberalism, one that takes these promises of equality and freedom and decides to actually enshrine them in policy. In material ways.
Well, this is interesting. When we're talking about anti-liberalism, I don't think we can avoid talking. One of the issues that probably the left hates John the most is that I think, John, you have offered sporadic critiques of, I think, what's happening at certain American colleges and universities in terms of the student body, but I feel like your critique is probably aimed more at the administrators and how they're reacting to it or the norms they're creating. Is that a fair assessment?
I have a real problem with the norms and protocols of discourse, especially around identity issues that you see on the left. And I think it tends to manifest itself in the most visible way on campuses, because campuses are one of the few places where the left has the political power to put these norms into practice, basically, which assume that there's no debate that can be had, that the answers are self-apparent, and disagreement is a form of assaulting people, that it's a form of harassment and assault. You see this a lot in social media. You see it in other micro communities, virtual communities, where the left has that kind of power. So I don't see it as a college problem per se, but yes, it's something I have written about. It's something, to connect back to the theme, Obama has spoken out about multiple times. Just a kind of mode of discourse. This is a whole other rabbit hole we could go in for a really, really long time. But I think it's oriented around the idea that we can't really argue these things. Sometimes that's explicit. Roxane Gay had a debate with me on NPR. She said, no, we can't debate identity politics. There's no debate to be had. When she said it, I don't think I'm distorting her view at all. That's exactly what she said.
Liz, do you have the same assessment of this? Do you think that there is that trend on portions of the left that's shutting down discussion, that's reducing people to immutable characteristics, that has some anti-liberal or illiberal characteristics?
I think it's maximalist liberalism. So Jean Bethke Elshtain has this great piece where she talks about sort of minimalist and maximalist forms of liberalism. So minimalist forms of liberalism sort of set very low barriers for entry into public discourse. So built into the idea of liberalism is sort of public reason, this sort of Rawlsian notion that we all need to basically speak the same language to do politics, and that the bar for entry into public discourse in a liberal society is basically that you respect liberal norms, freedom, equality, and so forth. But that bar can move up and down. Public reason changes. And so, the minimalist bar may be, well, you don't think people who are gay, lesbian, or transgender should be killed. So, unless, if you think that they should be killed for being the way they are, then your argument can't enter into public discourse. I think no liberal would tolerate that argument as a reasonable one we should debate on NPR. But then there's a maximalist form of liberalism that rises higher and says, if you think that transgender people are not genuinely the gender identity that they profess, that trans women aren't women, if that's your position, you are not respecting their equality, you're not respecting their freedom, your argument doesn't respect the norms of a liberal society, and so it can't enter into public discourse. It's a threat to liberal societies because it is essentially anti-equality, anti-freedom. And so this is very similar to the minimalist form of liberalism. It's just the bar has moved up somewhat, and you have a maximalist liberalism that says we're going to set a really high bar for entree into discourse and public reason. And so I think you see the kind of change happen a lot in liberalism. Obviously, we don't entertain the type of argument liberals in the 18th century did, right? Should women be able to vote? That's not a thing that we debate anymore. It's simply airing the view that women are not intelligent enough to vote, for example, to deserve the vote, is no longer passes the bar. And so that bar is always changing, and that's just a feature of liberalism. So when people say, like, do you see anti-liberalism on campus? I'm like, no, I see lots of liberalism on campus. I think that, like, this is just a historical feature of how the political ideology develops.
Yeah, I just, that's not the way I think that's a very clever way of looking at the problem. That's not the way I think it is. I think what you have, you may not want to go down as far the rabbit hole as I'm willing to go.
I think listeners would love to hear this, so please.
But I think the liberalism and conservatism, as Liz often points out, come from the same classic liberal tradition. And the heart of this tradition is to see the fundamental unit of society as the individual. And your model of politics is to protect the individual's right, and political rights have to be accrued to the individual. Now, obviously, our conception of who was an individual has changed dramatically, right? It didn't include anyone who wasn't a white male, 150 years ago. But it's sort of liberals have been pushing to apply that in a more broad way. But I think what the phenomenon I'm describing, and to some extent you're describing also, is not hyper-liberalism, but it's a rejection of that whole way of thinking. It's in some conscious or unconscious way. And it's a model that basically says, no, what politics actually is a conflict between the oppressor and the oppressed. And now this occurs in different spheres. It can be intersectional. It can have gender components, it can have race components, and we can have complex questions of what happens when they fight each other. But fundamentally, everything is a matter, anything that's a question of identity politics is a question of oppressed versus oppressor. And to the extent that you have rights, your rights can only be identified as to whether you're in the oppressed or the oppressor group. And then those questions, it's totally different answer as to whether you have real political rights or you don't have political rights, because what matters is the outcome, to free the oppressed from oppression. So that leads you to
let me try to synthesize this in a way, maybe then I can throw it to you, Liz. I think we often use the term identity politics, and some like Matthew Iglesias or Ezra Klein have argued everything's identity politics. Everyone has an identity, and we organize. There's farmers groups there. You can be Jewish, African American, gay, whatever. I don't necessarily think that's the most helpful way to frame the discussion we're trying to have. I usually think about it in terms of sectarianism. Like, we have sects or we have tribes, and our goal and our argumentation is basically formed around empowering those sects or tribes, which I think can be a very damaging thing in society. I've seen it quite a bit in South Asia. And I wouldn't say up until 4 or 5 years ago in the United States of America, I would have people calling me, for instance, a person of color. When I was growing up in the South, that used to be a term I would think I'd read in history books as colored people, because it was a term that segregated, put everybody who wasn't white in a giant pile and said that you're a group, which I've never thought of myself as the same group as being like Hispanic American, African American, Jamaican, Chinese, whatever. And second, it's a term that segregates everyone in that group from white folks, which to me just, I never found it to be a super helpful term for that.
I heard it in the early 90s when I was in college all the time. Every day.
College.
Yeah.
Well, that might be where a lot of this has come from.
So what did they call you in the South? Did you call a Muslim ethnically?
No, I mean,
Texas.
Well, I would think that if someone wanted to call me Pakistani American or Muslim, but generally my ethnicity did not come up. In fact, I'll always remember this. Right after 9/11, I think it was almost like the word must have gotten out or something. Zaid was Muslim, so people just came up to me and said, "Hey, we just think you're American. If anyone messes with you, come talk to us," right? Yeah. And I think that's...
Where did you grow up again?
I grew up outside Atlanta in Georgia. And I guess, that saying that we were all Americans, we all put American flags on our cars and everything, that was kind of what's called a superordinate identity, which is, there's something I think called like common identity hypothesis or something that says that when warring groups can adopt a higher identity that includes all of them as a supergroup, they tend to stop warring. I mean, we've seen this all over the world. In Iraq, people didn't think of themselves as Shia or Sunni prior to the Iraq War. I mean, they knew they were Shia or Sunni, but it was rarely talked about. In Pakistan, where my parents are from, we had Shia prime ministers, Sunni prime ministers. It rarely came up, rarely was talked about. But then, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, these groups exploited those divisions. When the Russians did social media intervention during 2016, one of the first things they did was they created black identity groups. They created conservative identity groups. The first thing they wanted people to do was to think more about their sect, or their tribe, and identify with that. It's not like these tribes and sects didn't exist. It's that they wanted to full frontal those in people's minds, because they know that when you do that, you start thinking about the differences between yourselves.
They even tried to promote California secessionism, which is sort of applying a Russian way of thinking about the world to the United States and thinking, let's get this region to break away. Like, it might work.
So I guess what I'm saying is, in the past 4 or 5 years, I say on the intellectual and activist left, because I don't think the average person in America who calls himself progressive or liberal necessarily thinks this way. But I think, especially in liberal NGOs and the activist sphere and places I've worked, there's more and more, well, the people of color think this way. How can you say that as a person of color? I get that all the time. I have no idea that, 3/5 of the planet all thinks alike and that we're all supposed to be in the same category. But this, and I never really got it in college, but I went to, I went to a state school, University of Georgia, maybe that was part of it. But in the past 4 or 5 years, that kind of language has exploded everywhere on the intellectual and activist left. And I'm kind of more with John on this. I feel like it's not so much talking about should we have slavery again versus what are the nature of bathrooms for transgender people. It's not about limiting or expanding debate. It's about creating an entirely different way of talking about politics, which is that you're in these sects and tribes, and those define everything about you, rather than discussing the principles of the underlying policies or laws. So, for instance, let's say John and I, and you, all of us were to talk about abortion. If you subscribe to this kind of sectarian thinking, you would say John and Zaid shouldn't be allowed to have an opinion about that because they're men.
Yeah.
Right? We're defined by that tribe or sect, not by whether we can conceptualize a moral worldview and argue that one out based on logical reason and so on and so forth. And to me, that really does seem like a very big shift in American politics that isn't necessarily normal. It seems like something that happens in societies that are becoming very tribal and sectarian, and are encouraging people to identify themselves within very, very narrow groups that are set up in kind of a Manichaean fashion.
Yeah, well, I think that, there's sort of two separate or maybe related but distinct issues. And one of them is this sort of rise of a question of who gets to speak, right? And that is, the sort of protests you get over, why are we having a white man speak on, women's poverty issues or something like that. You do see some of that on campus. In terms of how that fits with a liberal framework, I think the argument is always, we're trying to maximize women's freedom and equality, and that's not happening, right? The promises of liberalism are not being kept because of this oppression, which is deeply illiberal and is nonetheless unfolding under a liberal regime. So the argument is always, there's this promise in our society, of freedom and equality for everybody, and some groups are getting it and some groups are not. And that's part of what creates the kind of sectarian identification. The other issue is sort of the issue of kind of mass identification of groups. So you get this very funny phrase, women and people of color. So people who are doing election coverage will be like, how are women and people of color going to vote? And the answer is well, they all vote differently, right? You have subgroups within the groups. And remember after the midterms, there was so much consternation because white women voted for Trump. But it's it would be more accurate to say Republican women voted for Trump, right? You were always attaching an identity to an ideology when that connection is only there on the left, right? White women who are not on the left don't feel attached to this kind of obvious feminine liberal identity that women on the left say is very natural, right? And so, that's just that's a development in discourse that I think is fairly new, like you're saying. I think that it has to do with attempts to kind of, manifest those promises of liberalism, freedom and equality. And I think that it's very opposed to the kind of politics you're talking about, where we have kind of a supraordinate identity. They say, well, no, my lived experience doesn't match that. My lived experience does not match a supraordinate identity. And even if I went around saying I'm just an American, my life would be very different than other Americans.
So that white women voted for Trump meme, I think, is a good example of the phenomenon that we're criticizing, because it presumes that if you're a white woman who did not vote for Trump and is protesting against Trump, you have something to answer for by virtue of the fact that you belong to a group that voted for Trump.
Right.
That you basically, you should be reduced to the group that you belong to.
Yeah, there was lots of white women explain this, and I was like, well, they're Republicans. That's the explanation.
And that's why, sometimes I feel out of step, because when I hear this rhetoric, I just think this is reinforcing subordinate identities and essentializing people, and that's basically what racism does. That's basically what sexism does.
It's not right, and not as bad, not as damaging, but it does have that in common.
Well, it depends on the context of when it's damaging. For example, I think if you work at a liberal NGO in DC or New York City that follows this philosophy, probably being a white guy working at some of these places is much more uncomfortable than being me. I mean, I've seen people just dressed down in absolutely humiliating ways, and no one ever does that to me. And I just think that in that situation, I seem to have the privilege. I certainly think it's contextual. I mean, I grew up in the South. There are parts of the South that would probably never elect an African-American person to represent their district, and there's no question in my mind that if you're African-American, you're going to have far greater challenges in that district if you run for politics or something. But I also know that in certain left-wing and liberal spaces, it seems like I actually am the one who has the privilege by just the pure accident of my melanin in my skin.
As long as you're distinguishing between these subcultures that are a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the country and the country as a whole. Like, it's not, right, like, a white person in your office might be dealing with a lot of garbage that you don't have to deal with, but that doesn't mean as a whole, like, their life as an American is worse. People are often using that argument to dismiss these pathological forms of behavior on the left by saying racism is worse, let's focus on that. Racism is worse, let's focus on that. But the things you're talking about are also real. It's not as big of a problem, but you can be against different problems at the same time.
Well, I think, getting back to the analogy I do with South Asia, there's a lot of people who, for instance, in India, if you talk about Hindu nationalism, they'll jump to say, well, what is Pakistani intelligence doing? What is, Hindus are oppressed in Pakistan. What about Islamists? We have these terrorist attacks. That's what I talk about sectarian thinking. Sectarian thinking tells you that you have one enemy, and there's a righteous sort of victim, and there's an oppressive kind of group. And your goal the entire time is to fight the oppressor and to support the victims. But the life is actually far more complicated than that, I found. There are all sorts of ways to mistreat people, and there's all sorts of ways people in every form of demographic or identity group are sometimes mistreated. And I think, Liz, that gets back to me thinking that this is not so much a form of hyper-liberalism as just arguing against individual rights and liberties to begin with, which does seem almost like pre-Enlightenment thinking. I mean, maybe that was a form of liberalism. I don't know.
No, there are certain aspects of culture that came before liberalism and still survive inside of it. I think that, liberalism always had these carve-outs for maintaining identities, right? John Rawls refers to different comprehensive doctrines that can exist as long as you share this same public reason. And again, I think that the arguments tend to be that the forms of speech that people are objecting to are actually endangering freedom, equality, and democracy by promoting what they racist or sexist ideologies. And public reason has always had that built in. Rawls did not support anti-democratic speech, right? As types of speech or discourse that were dangerous to liberal democracy. Obviously, liberal democracy can't tolerate those. We change our minds over time as to what constitutes forms of speech that are dangerous to liberal democracy. And so maybe one argument that you might be advancing is, well, the types of speech that are getting banned effectively are not actually dangerous. and that the banning of them is creating, a more severe backlash or the context for a more damaging outcome inside liberal democracy than banning them in the first place.
Well, and that's one thing I wanted to bring up that John said, is that John described these as subcultures, and I think that's right. I think that John is often criticized for exaggerating what's happening on college campuses because it's not, it's not that big of a deal. It doesn't represent that many people. But I think what people miss is that these are elite subcultures. They help form American culture. They help staff the government. They help staff the major media outlets. They staff Hollywood and record labels. So that's why I think they're kind of worth arguing about. But I think
think tanks.
Think tanks. They staff think tanks, and because they are they do occupy elite positions in the culture, they could impact the wider culture. So if we're seeing autocratic, or in Liz's term, hyper-liberal or maximalist liberal kind of thinking, it could very well filter down to the rest of American society. And I think liberals recognize this when they see like a Klan rally somewhere. Like almost no Americans identify with the Ku Klux Klan, but that doesn't mean we say, oh, it's not that bad, it's just a few people. We still say it's still pretty bad. Except this time, the people with these ideologies are in very elite positions. And I think that's part of why, and I'm sure I'm going to get piled on for saying this, I appreciate a lot of what John has to write about this, and I appreciate the way you described it, Liz, because I've never seen anyone describe it that way, but it may be a way that makes the political left more palatable to doing some self-criticism about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think that my hope for the left would be to just, assess threats to liberal democracy wisely, right? So, I don't pick on, college kids, for several reasons. And I think that, I don't actually disagree that much with the division of society into the oppressed and the oppressor, because I do think there is actually a lot of value in that viewpoint. One of the things that it does is it creates supraordinate identities. So it actually does elide a lot of those divisions that can make political activity difficult. For example, when you refer to the working class, you're uniting lots and lots and lots of people of different races and religious backgrounds, sexual orientations, and genders. And you can only do that by positing that they're different in some way by nature of a labor relation and a wage relation to capital.
Right, but I think the major difference is that the way you're setting up society is a small elite that would be very hard to argue are not extremely powerful and privileged in virtually every circumstance, versus I think what John often criticizes is a type of tribalism and sectarianism that can divide up every classroom in America, right, into men and women and whites and blacks and gays and Muslims and Jews and atheists.
Right, with a grand privilege matrix, right. And
with a matrix that says you can behave racially abusive or sexually abusive or you can make sexist comments towards someone if they happen to fit within the right place on the pyramid, which I think is the problem.
And there's no need for discourse, right? There's the duty is allyship, right? The person with a lesser level of oppression needs to listen to the position of the person with the greater level of oppression, and can't argue with them in any form. You not only need to take it into account their perspective, which is what everyone should do, but you can't question it. You have to be an ally by adopting their point of view.
That public reason.
Right. Well, I'm sure this is a topic we're going to return to on many episodes, but I want to end on sort of a more positive note. I think it's remarkable that the three of us were able to sit down here. I'm sure we've all butted heads at one point or another, online or offline or somewhere else. And I guess what I'd like for you guys to do is just explain in your own words sort of why you think something like this is valuable. Why is it you think that people who are often at each other's throats in our politics need to just be able to sit down and talk to each other like this?
Well, I'm a proponent of de-escalation of tensions. I think that's always a good thing. I think that, it makes, the points that you want to make and the arguments you want to have more resonant. And I think that, especially as the left becomes a more dominant force in American politics and comes into its own, it's definitely going to have to develop a language of argumentation that can unfold in public, in a pretty regular, predictable way. And I'm excited to see that happening. And of course, it's going to require, engaging in a way that is fairly acceptable to the majority of participants in the conversation. And also, I don't know, it's not good to have discourse running extremely hot all the time. It puts a lot of people at risk. It makes a lot of people unhappy. But the people who really get nailed and who lose their jobs and so forth for getting into really hot arguments online where they're saying very hot things are oftentimes people on the left, right? And so, I don't even think it's good for them. And so, that's one of my concerns is people talk about respectability politics. I understand the critique. But yeah, the left is becoming a really respectable, serious political force in American politics. And so, I think kind of having a discourse that we can do in public that is argumentative, that is strong, that is robust, and also that, reaches people, even who are hesitant or have disagreements, is important.
And once you've gotten power, then you can start killing everybody.
Exactly. That's when we purge.
How about you, John? What do you think's valuable about this, and what if you could wave a wand and just change America's current political culture? And I'm not talking about a set of policies. I'm talking about how we relate to and interact with each other, online and off. What would you do? What would you want to see?
Do you want Matt to delete his account?
Can I? As a professional discipline, I feel like I've always been someone who uses mockery. To me, mockery is the seasoning you put on the food. You can't just eat the seasoning. You've got to have the food with it. And in particular, if you're going to mock someone, you've got to take their argument seriously. You've got to read the whole thing. You've got to understand it. You've got to be able to encapsulate what they're saying from the premises they're working from, and you've got to work through them. And in the cases where you could show someone's just completely botching the facts or completely botching the logic, that's where you go in and say, this is an idiot. But everyone's not an idiot. Everyone you disagree with isn't an idiot. You've got to be able to distinguish between those cases, because if everyone you disagree with is an idiot, they're probably not idiots. You're probably the idiot.
Thanks for listening to Extremely Offline. XO is co-produced by me, Leighton Woodhouse, and Zaid Jilani. Our music is by Breakmaster Cylinder. We'll see you next week.